what we said is as follows. Wait, let me just let one or two people into there. Okay. What we said is as follows. That before we're born, in the... I'm going to give it another minute. Just let anybody else who wants to connect. Okay. What we said is as follows. Before we were born, we actually lived before we were born. We were very real. We were a very real entity in heaven. And before we were born, our souls made two oaths. One is to be good, one is to be a tzaddik, and the other is not to be a rasha. We also advise that even if you get to such a level in life that where the perception is you're a tzaddik, look at yourself as wicked. We question that from two questions. One, if you look at yourself as wicked, you'll become depressed. And secondly, it contradicts a Mishnah. So we need to understand that. We're only going to come back to that in chapter 13. In order to understand that, we're going on a journey of understanding who we are. And it's so important to understand who you are because you can work with who you are. Because then you can work with who you are. So, in the first chapter, the Alter Rebbe told us that we have two souls. One is a godly and one is an animal. In chapter 2, we started to learn more about the godly soul. That there are different levels of godly souls, but if you put your infrared glasses on, the godly soul that we have within us, the godly soul that we have within us comes from a place where godliness is absolutely revealed. So every single Jew, we'll discuss Jews and non-Jews another time, but every single Jew has part of God within him, which is just truly a part of God. You know, in this week's Torah portion, you learn about wells. Jacob digging wells. In last week's Pasha, Yitzchak digging wells. This week's Pasha, Jacob meets his spouse by a well. A water well is very connected to Jewish thinking. I want to compare the Jewish well, a natural wellspring of water, to the neshama. A natural wellspring, unlike a river or a lake, it's different. A river or a lake can become dried up. But a well can never become dried up. It can be diverted, it can be clogged up, but it's there. And that's the godly soul that a Jew has within us. Sometimes we forget that we have it. Sometimes we sin and we get involved in all sorts of things we shouldn't get involved in. But it's always there. And one moment, something like reveals it, and all of a sudden that love comes gushing out. And that's why throughout Jewish history, Jews have been prepared to give up their life for God. Not that they were expecting reward in heaven. It's just that's what a Jew does. It's that natural love for God. Anyway, so we spoke about the godly soul, that it's truly part of God that comes within us. In chapter 3, we explored the godly soul. We said the godly soul actually has 10 parts, 3 intellectual parts and 7 emotional parts, but they're connected to the soul. Now, how does the soul express itself in this world? How does it connect back to God? Well, what are the main emotions? Love and respect, or love and discipline. How does one show one's spouse that they love them? By speech and action. My darling, I love you, or buying a gift that the spouse wants. We explained that. And by holding back and not doing the things that your spouse wants, that's where you connect your other part of your soul to God. So your love and fear and their offshoots, which we've discussed at length, how do they become connected to your spouse? Through speech and action. I love you, here is the gift. So too with God. How do we connect back to God? By saying to God, I love you, through prayer and by doing mitzvahs. In chapter 5, which we're in the middle of, in chapter 5 we spoke about the quality of learning Torah. Now, whether the shir is good or not is actually irrelevant. What's really happening when a group of ladies who could be doing anything else at this particular moment have opted to spend a half an hour learning Tanya, what's really happening? So what did God do? God took his infinite wisdom. You have to understand, let's think about what the Torah is. The Torah is not the book that you buy in the bookshop. What is the Torah? The Torah is really the infinite wisdom and inner desires of God. Digest that. What is the Torah? The Torah is the infinite wisdom and inner desires of God, and God and his desires and God and his wisdom are one. So you have this infinite teaching called the Torah. It's God's wisdom. God took that infinite wisdom and he squashed it, he condensed it into a book form that is so easy to read that even a 6-year-old child can read the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob traveling. He can read that story. The same Kabbalist can read exactly the same story on a different level. But what is really happening? The knowledge in that book, now remember, the knowledge in the book of the Torah is the infinite wisdom of God, which is beyond our reach. So God takes this infinite wisdom that is beyond our reach, he condenses it, he simplifies it into a simple book called the Torah and all the other writings that belong to the Torah. And then, when a group of ladies and myself sit now and we learn Torah, what's really happening? The thing that we're learning becomes enveloped in our minds. It's enveloped in our minds. Our minds are enveloping the thing that we're learning. The thing that we're learning is becoming enveloped in our mind, right? The concept is becoming enveloped in our mind. We didn't know it an hour ago. Now we're starting to know it. Not only that, but it becomes totally interwoven in our minds. It becomes totally one with us when we're learning it. So what are we becoming totally one with? The infinite wisdom of God. There is no better way of becoming one and united with God than through the learning of Torah, because the subject becomes inside of you, becomes totally one with you. And that's not when you're flirting with it, when you're just listening to it. It's like when you're really concentrating and understanding it well, and you're learning it for the right reason. The Torah that you're learning becomes totally one with you. You have become totally one with God. So if ever you want to be intimate with God, if ever you want to become totally one with God, just learn Torah. Any level of Torah. That is, now I want to take it from, that's what we've learned until now, that you're becoming totally one. And even if you're learning something in the Torah, that's totally hypothetical. The fact that it's in the Torah means it's the wishes and the inner desires of God. And when you're learning it, you are becoming one with that. I want to take from the top of page 95. And this is the great quality of the knowledge of Torah and understanding Torah. I'll call mitzvahs maasiyos compared to all the other mitzvahs. Because there's a rule in the Torah, which we said before, the Talmud Torah keneged kulam. There are 613 mitzvahs. One of those mitzvahs is Talmud Torah. It outweighs all the other mitzvahs. So Shabbos candles is important, and every mitzvah has its power. But the mitzvah which has a quality over all other mitzvahs is undoubtedly learning Torah. I'll call mitzvahs maasiyos, right? I'll call mitzvahs maasiyos, va'afilu al mitzvahs atluyos b'dibur. Understanding Torah, hasagosa, thinking, understanding, comprehending Torah has a quality on all other mitzvahs, even the mitzvah of teaching Torah. Va'afilu al mitzvahs talmud Torah b'dibur, which happens through speech, and he'll explain now. Why is thinking Torah, why is comprehending Torah, why does it have a quality over all other mitzvahs? Ki al kol mitzvahs sheb'dibur u'ma'aseh, because all the mitzvahs that are done through speech and action, HaKadosh Baruch Hu malbeshes hanefesh, God envelops, he encloses the soul. When you do a mitzvah, when you light Shabbos candles, I don't want you to think of it anymore as you lighting Shabbos candles and just bringing light into the world, but actually that light is a godly light, and that godly light envelops you. So when you do a mitzvah, whatever that mitzvah might be, God is enveloping you. God is enveloping you from head to toe. When you light Shabbos candles, you are enveloped from head to toe. But with the knowledge of Torah, besides the fact that your mind is enclosed in God, besides the fact that you're enveloped by God, like by any other mitzvah, God is inside of you, because the Torah is coming into your head. Lighting Shabbos candles or any other mitzvah you might do, God is surrounding you, he's enveloping you, he's enclothing you. But when you learn Torah, God's going inside of you. Right? Each person according to what you can comprehend. But it doesn't matter if your intelligence is little, if your intelligence is a lot, if your knowledge is a little or your knowledge is a lot, you are getting God inside of you. Each person will get God inside of him depending on what he's learning on the different levels of the Torah, which I will elaborate on this year. Look at this. It says, look at the last lines. Each man according to his intellect and his capacity for knowledge, understanding in pardes. I'll explain to you what that means. The four modes of the Torah. Give me one sec. Now, we'll come back to that. Let's go back. Let's go to the next page, 96. Ulefi should be dias haTorah. HaTorah mulveshes benefshot and b'sichel mukefes b'soicham. Now, since by learning of the Torah goes inside of you, lochein. Since your mind is enveloping the Torah is going inside of you, unlike any other mitzvah which envelops you. Lochein Lochen dikras b'shem lechem umozan hanefesh. Therefore, Torah is called the food of the soul. What does it mean it's called the food of the soul? Just like food, when it goes inside of you, it sustains you. What happens when food goes inside of you? It becomes part of your flesh and blood. And that's the way you live. You eat food in order for that food to be transformed into flesh and blood, and that's what keeps you alive in this world. So too, when a person learns Torah, the Torah becomes one with him. When the Torah that we're learning now becomes totally one in our mind, not just enveloping our mind, but totally interwoven in our mind, totally digested in our mind, the Torah becomes food for the soul. The Chaim Bikirbo, and the Torah becomes a life force within us. Where's that life force coming from? Not from the soil like regular food. It's coming, and where does it come from? It comes from Hashem, the giver of life. Now, we didn't do this last week. As it says in the books of Kabbalah, Shar Mem Dalek Peri Gimel, when a person's soul leaves this world, where does that soul go? So the body goes to sleep. I want to point out over here that there's always part of the soul. One day we'll do a whole share just on the soul and the body, etc., etc. But part of the soul always remains attached to the body. And the soul feels what the body's going through after death. And that's why no matter how many years after a person's died, you can go to the grave, because the person is always there. There's always part of the soul there. So I want you to compare a soul for this year to thought. If you're talking about a physical entity, this pen is either here or there. When you're speaking about thought, I can be teaching you, but I can be thinking about my family at the same time. Not that I should be totally concentrated here, but my mind can be in two different places. So too with the neshama, there's neshama in heaven. Part of it always remains attached to the body, but part of that soul enters into a world where godliness is revealed. Now, there are millions and millions of levels of what it means godly revelation. But as soon as one is freed from physical sickness, and as soon as one is freed from the frustrations of this world and the insecurities of this world, the soul starts to appreciate the lower level of the world to come, where you start feeling God's emotions, and then you can go into feeling God's intellect. So it's a 3,000-4,000 year journey. It's an infinite journey to appreciate God. And that's why souls who died 3,000 years ago are still every day energized, enlightened by godly revelation in the world to come. Now, with this in mind, we can understand what it says. That Shalavusha Neshamas Bagan Heina Mitzvahs. What are the garments? What's the clothing? In this world, the clothing that protects me from the elements, and this clothing that bring me honor, are the physical clothing that I wear. In the next world, if a person lives in the equator and doesn't have clothing on, they'll be burnt up by the sun. And the same thing, if somebody lives in freezing weather and they don't have clothing, they'll freeze to death. So clothing doesn't only bring one honor and doesn't only help one dress, but it actually protects you as well and helps you enjoy life. If you don't have a proper coat in London, you're going to freeze. So what prevents you from freezing in the next world, or from getting too much godly radiance? It's garments that you wear. So what are the garments that you wear in the world to come? You don't wear the garments that you wear here. Every single time you did a mitzvah, that mitzvah enveloped you. It becomes clothing. And every single time you've done a mitzvah in this world, it becomes clothing that allows you, please be abstract here, that allows you to enjoy the rays of godly inspiration that's there in the next world. So every single time you do a mitzvah here, you're creating clothing around you that will protect you and give you the radiance in the next world, and even when resurrection comes. So the mitzvahs we do now has an eternal effect. Now look further. So the mitzvahs that you do in this world becomes clothing that protect you around you, but the Torah that you learn becomes the food of the soul. The food of the soul. So sometimes you can have, I say this cautiously, but sometimes you could have in this world a person who looks very physically strong, but really spiritually is very weak, very undernourished. Now, in order to achieve this, you have to learn Torah lishma. What is lishma? I touched on it last week. That when you're learning Torah in order I'm doing this for Hashem. So why am I coming to the shir this morning? Because Hashem wanted me to learn Torah. That's the highest level of learning Torah. I'm not learning it because of an ulterior motive. I'm learning it. I'm just stopping for a minute before I learn and say, Hashem, I'm doing this for you. So when I do mitzvahs, those mitzvahs become clothing for my soul, not just like physical clothing, but it actually brings me honor in the world to come. And it also allows me to enjoy the rays of spiritual sunlight that will be in the next world, that I don't get burnt up. And when I learn Torah for the right reason, the Torah becomes one with me from the giver of life, and that becomes the food of the soul in the next world. And of course, ish kefi sichla k'mashu kosev b'pri eitz chaim. And here's a very important point. Everybody on his particular level. It doesn't matter what level you're on. As long as you're using yourself, giving it the best, you will be connecting to God. Now, is this going to be a bit Kabbalistic now? Bahamozin, what is this food of the soul that we spoke about? He bechinas or pnimi. So it's not a physical food that we relate to in this world, but let's take the spiritual dimension of food. Food has a soul in it. So Bahamozin, he bechinas or pnimi. There are different types of radiances in the next world. The inner light, the internal light that comes inside of you, that is the food of the soul. Balavushim bechinas makifim. The clothing is the all-encompassing energies that will surround you. So you don't have physical food in the next world, and you don't have physical food. You don't have physical food and physical clothing. The physical clothing is the protective energies that will come and surround you in the world to come. And then the rays that will go inside of your soul, that is the inner light. Now we can understand something. Lochen, therefore, Omru Rabboseinu Zochreinin Mivrocha. Therefore our Rabbi said, Shetalmud Torah Shokol Keneged Kol HaMitzvahs, that learning Torah outweighs all the other mitzvahs that you could do. Why? Lefi sha'mitzvahs hein levushim levad. Because if you think about a mitzvah like Shabbos candles or whatever mitzvah it might be, it envelops you. It envelops you around you. It's clothing. But Torah, learning Torah is not just, learning Torah is a food and a clothing. It's also clothing. Why is it also clothing? לפי שהמצוות הן לבושים לבד, והתורה היא מוזן וגם לבוש לנפש המסחלס, שמסלבש בו בעיון ובלימוד וכל שכן כשמייצד בפיו בדיבור. Because when you're learning Torah, not only does it surround you, but it also comes inside of you. Particularly when you're teaching Torah, when you're asking questions and the Torah is coming out of our mouth. So we're being enveloped and we're getting the Torah inside of us. And that's why the learning of Torah outweighs all the other mitzvahs. Because all other mitzvahs, it just envelops you. The learning of Torah envelops you and comes inside of you. In the 10 minutes that we've got left, I just want to clarify. He said something then, because we're doing it properly. Some of you might have heard this from me before. He said every person can learn Torah on 4 different levels. Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Soid. Which means to say as follows, that when God wrote the Torah, He wrote the Torah can be defined or explained on 4 different levels, or we'll see later even on a 5th level. There are 5 dimensions to the Torah. I want to give you an analogy to explain what I mean. I know some of you have heard this before. I want you to imagine an artist. And this artist only paints, he's the most amazing artist, but he only paints a painting when he uses another talent that he has. So you have this artist, he's a beautiful artist, he can predict the future. It's a make-up story. He can predict the future. He's a chemical engineer, and he's an astronomer. He only paints a painting when he can put all these 4 talents into his painting. Good. He paints a painting, and it goes into one of the great galleries. It's a painting of a battlefield. A 10-year-old child walks in with his father to the gallery, and he says, "Daddy, wow, look at that beautiful picture of a battlefield." The father turns to the son and says, "Son, you're right. It's a beautiful picture of a battlefield. You're correct. But you're taking the simple explanation of the painting. I know that the artist only paints paintings like that when he can predict the future. And I know a war's about to break out." So both of them looked at exactly the same picture and both took different explanations. And both right, by the way. They're both connected to the painting. A third guy walks in who's a chemical engineer. He doesn't look at the simple explanation of the painting. He doesn't look what the painting's hinting at. He looks how this particular artist had a particular technique of mixing oils and chemicals and all sorts of things to create the most amazing look on his canvas. It's not just regular painting. he takes that methodology and he applies it elsewhere. It has nothing to do with the painting. He's a chemical engineer. A fourth guy walks in as an astronomer and says, oh my God, on planet Pluto, there's a war breaking out because this artist is studying Pluto at the moment and he only paints a painting when he can bring astronomy into it. Now, all four looked at exactly the same painting and took different explanations. It's the same thing with the Torah, by the way. You can take the simple explanation, the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You know, the story on a simple level of Abraham Avinu traveling downward to Egypt. It's a simple explanation. What's a simple explanation? The way you teach it to a kid. Abraham Avinu comes to Egypt. Abraham Avinu comes to the land of Canaan. There's a famine. He has to travel downward. According to Kabbalah, it's Abraham Avinu's his spiritual journeys. But one day we will take a few sentences and we'll learn them on a simple explanation and on a Kabbalistic explanation. It's absolutely fun, interesting. But no matter what you're learning, whether you're learning it on a Kabbalistic level or if you're learning on a simple level, you're connecting to the oneness of God. Which brings us to the close of chapter 5. So chapter 1, we learned that we have two souls. Chapter 2, 3, and 4. Chapter 2 and 3, we explored the godly soul a little bit. 4, we explained how the godly soul expresses itself through thought, speech, and action. The same way that a husband has to express to his spouse, to his wife, or wife to the husband, their love through speech and action and thought. In chapter 5, we learned about the great quality of thought. When you're thinking Torah, you're actually bringing God within you, and God is becoming interwoven within you. And when you're driving down the street and you think through a shiur, don't kid yourself, something amazing is happening. You know, on Jewish thinking, by the way, the whole idea of mental telepathy, bringing somebody into your thought process. Or what actually happens, it says that when you think about God, you're bringing God within you. So if you bring, God's continuously connected to you. But if you're bringing bad thoughts, if you're thinking bad thoughts, the Alter will speak about it in chapter 23. If you're thinking bad thoughts, you're actually schlepping God there with you. God's tied up within you. So you must be really be careful what's going inside. A person has to be very careful what's going inside one's head. The way you think about others has an effect on you. But have you ever thought about somebody and all of a sudden you see the person or something happens? It's very much alive in Jewish thinking. I want to just take a few minutes and discuss with you. The month of Kislev is connected to the book of Tanya, which we're learning. In fact, for us who go through the book of Tanya every year, we start it again next Friday, the 19th of Kislev. We learn a bit and we finish it over a year. In the teachings of Chassidus, there's great emphasis of going to see a Rebbe. Now, just on a regular level, if I wanted to open up a business, I would go see a mentor who knows business well, who has my interests at heart, and I would try to find the best businessman in the world and ask him advice. Once you start studying the souls, you'll see all our souls are connected. All our souls are connected. And that's what makes the Jewish people unique. In each generation, there is the tzaddik, who's the head of that generation. So in a more mystical philosophy, it was really important to try and go and see the tzaddik, to go and see a Rebbe, and the highest level of your soul connected to the highest level of his soul in that private audience called Yechidus. And I think every Israeli prime minister had Yechidus with the Rebbe. People from all walks of life had amazing experiences with the Rebbe. Now, put that into the pot. Also in Jewish thinking, there was always, throughout history, the idea of going to a tzaddik's grave. And you went to a tzaddik's grave and you prayed there because it's holy land. Because here, according to Kabbalah, according to Kabbalistic thinking, nobody dies, by the way. We look at death as major immigration. When a parent passes away or grandparent passes away, just major immigration. Somebody who left Russia 300 years ago and went to another country, it was like they were dead. In fact, the Rambam brings in Jewish law that if you hadn't seen somebody for a year, right, you would say the bracha, God who resurrects the dead, because they were like dead. You never saw them before. Which helps us understand death, by the way. Death is nothing more than major immigration. 500 years ago, you couldn't pick up a little cell phone and call somebody, look at them on the thing, on FaceTime or WhatsApp video and speak to them across the globe. They honestly were like dead. But death is nothing more than major immigration. When the Mashiach comes, all the souls will descend back down to this world. But nonetheless, when a tzaddik was alive, you would go and see him and ask him advice. You would ask him advice just generally for a blessing, that things should be good. Or you would ask him advice for health. Or you would ask him for a bracha for wealth. Or you would ask him for a bracha for children. Or God forbid you messed up, you need a tikkun, whatever. You would go and see a Rebbe, the tzaddik of the generation. Let me stop there. Let me tell you a story. By the way, when the Rebbe was alive, the famous Lubavitcher Rebbe, towards the end of his life, he would go, I think, twice a week with a big brown envelope, a massive brown envelope, a massive brown bag, and anybody who ever wrote to the Rebbe would take those letters to the grave of the previous Rebbe. If anybody ever wrote to the Rebbe, see the letters I have, the Rebbe would always answer, I will remember you at the grave of my father-in-law. Every Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe would go there. I remember once in 1979 going to visit the Rebbe. I was a student in Yeshiva, and every Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe would go to the grave of the previous Rebbe, and everybody else would as well. I remember the Rebbe crying, reading a South African aerogram. An aerogram was like a blue envelope that didn't need an envelope. I remember the Rebbe reading it and crying. But the Rebbe kept the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe alive. There's a story in the Gemara. The Gemara tells a story that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the author of the Mishnah 1800 years ago, before he died, he called his family together, and he says, my family, you can go read it in the Gemara. My family, I want my table prepared in its usual way, my table where I ate. My candelabra that gave me light, I want it set on the table. And my bed should be prepared like always. And the Gemara says, listen to the story, that after death, this is not in a Kabbalistic book, this is in the Gemara, that after death, the Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi would come back every single Friday night physically and make Kiddush for his family. It stopped where a neighbor came and the maidservant said, I'm sorry, you can't come in now because Rabbi is visiting from the other world. Rabbi said, the secret's getting out and I'm not coming back. But every single night, Friday night, he would come back and physically make Kiddush for his family. It's not the only recorded story, by the way. In Jewish law, there are many times where people came back physically from the other world. So there are billions of things happening around us that we're just not aware of. Anyways, to come back to the story, shortly after the previous Rebbe passed away in 1950, the Rebbe explained that Gemara. The Gemara said, why would somebody go and see a Rebbe when they were alive? Why would somebody go and see a Rebbe when they were alive? For health issues, for sustenance, for wealth issues, or for children, or God forbid if they sinned. The Rebbe said that's why Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who did come back physically every Friday night and make Kiddush for his family, that's why he wanted those three things prepared. What is shulchan? Where do you eat? Why did he want his table prepared? Where does one eat? At a table. He was telling his children that even if you need to speak to me after death about sustenance, you can come ask me for a bracha. A candle is compared to a candelabra is compared to the health, light, neravai nishmas adam, the soul. If you're not physically or emotionally healthy, or somebody in your family, you can come and see me, not just while I'm alive, but even when I leave this world. And a bed is where children are made. You can come and see me about that as well. So therefore the Rebbe would send people to the grave of the previous Rebbe for many years. Since the Rebbe passed away, it became a big thing to go to the grave of the Rebbe. And every year I always took a group. This year, on Sunday, I'm doing a Zoom experience. Don't expect a wonderful tour. It's like this. I'm giving people the opportunity to write a letter to the Rebbe. And then on Sunday afternoon at 5 o'clock, so to write, this is what I'm saying to people. Anybody wants to join, I'm going to post the invitation on our group straight after this. How it works is as follows. If you do want to come, you write a letter to the Rebbe on Friday or any day this week, but by the latest Sunday morning. And by Sunday 12 o'clock, you have to email it to me. I will not look at the letter, and I will send it to somebody who's at the grave of the previous Rebbe, because there's a whole yeshiva and shul there. And that person who I've already spoken to will gather all the letters together, and he also won't look at them. And then he's going to take us in to the grave of the Rebbe and put our letters there. So if anybody would like to join, it's not going to be a long process. That is what's going to happen. So I'm going to send you the invitation to join. And then if you want to, Thursday evening, I'm going to just do simple instructions to remind people what to do. And then Sunday afternoon, we'll all go in together on a Zoom, and there's one or two prayers that you say afterwards. Now, I think, by the way, that in this world where there's a pandemic sweeping the world, we've got to do more things to make goodness go viral. So please, God, let's all increase. Please don't feel obliged to come, but if anybody would like to come, it'd be an honor to have you. But I want to wish you all a good week. Next week, we start the animal soul. 6, 7, 8, and 9. We're going to learn all about the animal soul and all about the naughtiness in the world and why God gave it to us. That's going to be for the next 3 chapters, 6, 7, and 8. And then we're going to learn about the struggle, how man has to have struggle every day of his life. But in the meantime, may Mashiach come immediately. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thanks, Rabbi. Thank you.